The 20th century was a broad expanse of history and time during which fashion evolved and flowed. In the first half of the century, women's fashion and accessories were primarily dictated by Paris fashion, social standards, and events in society. This overview of the accessories of a century will hopefully bring light to this evolution of fashion. In a social context, the ostrich feather fan was often paired with evening wear during the 1900s. While a beautiful accessory, fans had a special function. Fans had a language all their own, allowing ladies to express themselves in a more secretive and tactful way. Depending on how a woman handled her fan could show how she really felt towards a person while still being polite. In the late 1910s, it was still considered a social standard for women to wear hats. During this time, between the 1910s and 1920s, the brims of hats widened and dropped lower to the brow of the face. Women's independence was also changing. A woman named Hannah Krause owned and ran the shop where the hat from the exhibition was made. At the time, a woman owning a business was uncommon and a large step outside the social norm. In the Roaring Twenties, Art Deco was all the rage, and so were new flashy accessories to go with the new clothing. Chain mesh purses were a popular accessory for women and often sported the Art Deco style as seen on the bags in the exhibition. These purses normally could not carry more than a powder puff or perhaps a tube of lipstick, but were an aesthetic accessory for the time for most fashionable women. The 1930s brought a want for quality in fashion. There was not a lot of money to spend, and smart women wanted a product that would hold up to their use. The shoes in the exhibition have the Good Housekeeping seal in the heel of the right shoe. Good Housekeeping magazine would test products of their choice, and if the product performed to the magazine's high standards, it would be awarded the Good Housekeeping seal. Due to these high standards, the Good Housekeeping seal became a marker of quality in the 30s and helped women be more thrifty with their money. In the 1940s, the Depression caused many restrictions to be put on supplies, and rationing occurred in clothing. Even in the case of hats, a limited amount of fabric was allowed, and several hats shrunk in size. The doll hat was one of these. It was worn perched on the front crown of the head and was held on with a hoop against the back of the head. The hat in the exhibit is embellished with a veil, ribbon, and ostrich feather puff. While hats' materials were rationed, embellishments like feathers and ribbons were not. This meant that embellishments were used often and were sometimes oversized to allow the wearer to have a unique hat to represent their individuality during this dark time. Prior to the 1950s, gloves were considered an appropriate accessory for women on almost all occasions. During the war rationing, they had been produced and worn less often, mostly due to the lack of materials and money. In the 1950s, gloves were worn again, but only really for parties and social gatherings. They were also most commonly cut full-length or three-quarter length. While they had been a required garment once upon a time, in the 1950s gloves became an accessory rather than a fashion requirement for women. Up until the 1960s, Paris fashion primarily dictated the fashion scene. From the 1960s onward, there was a shift in fashion. Fashion became more individualized and more of a personal accent rather than a social requirement. During the 1960s in particular, the youthquake, or younger generation, wanted to dress differently than Paris fashion dictated. They sought out new fashions from more independent designers such as Mary Quant. Inspiration was often drawn from pop art and incorporated into clothing. In the case of the exhibition hat, while it is a church hat for its owner, the hat had been styled in the color blocking used in pop art, which reflected the trickle-up of fashion at this time. The 1970s continued the trend of accessories becoming a personal accent rather than a social requirement. This happened in many fashion subculture groups, such as the hippies, who are associated with earth tones, leather fabrics, and the patchwork pattern. The patchwork pattern in particular spread to many accessories including handbags, purses, and shoes, allowing different groups to add this accent to their outfit if they so pleased during the 70s. The 80s favored luxury in most of what was worn. The excess of money in the average person's wallet made spending pleasurable and socially acceptable. A lot of media from this time reflected this want of decadence, especially in the TV show Dynasty, which showed women in the latest fashions with larger-sized sets of jewelry and chandelier earrings. While the want for more may seem like too much today, it allowed the public to mimic the people they idolized and to make themselves feel expensive. An economic recession in the 90s put an end to the excess from the 80s. However, women still wished to be fashionable, and now it was a question of finding the look for less while still considering personal style. Accessories such as the chunky-heeled shoe helped women to combine different street styles with what they wanted in stores. Personalization became the style, and the minimal use of accessories helped to encourage the mix-and-match idea that the 90s helped to make popular. It was about being your own woman with your own fashion, rather than what fashion, society, and standards set out for you to show. From decadence to minimalism, fashion accessories went a long way in 100 years.